Good morning all. Welcome to today's session, or sharing session as we like to call it, on loan workers with Petra. We are very happy to have her here. And today, like I just mentioned, the presentation will be recorded. This helps for us just to make sharing a bit more easier for other individuals that couldn't attend today, as well as if you want to come back and potentially see something that you could have potentially have missed. So hence why we want to record this one. I'm just going to go through a couple of housekeeping rules, if that's okay with you. Petra, if you're just going to click over to us, next slide. Thank you. So guys, your microphones are on mute, so please make use of the questions and answer functionality if you've got any questions for myself or for Petra. If you want to have general chat, please make use of the chat function. I'll be monitoring the chat function as well. Towards the end, I will read some of the questions to Petra, and if we have some time left and Petra is willing, I could potentially open up some of the lines for you to ask live questions. Okie dokie. So then, from our side, I just want to let you know my name is Wes. I'm from ShopCare. I'm a business manager there, and I look after retail manufacturing and supply chain. And when it comes to mostly critical risks, in form of risks in general, but what we are currently working on from a ShopCare perspective is we're working towards a violent and aggressive behavior solutions specifically for the customer-facing workers out there. So we've got quite a bit happening in that space. We just finished our critical risk report that is basically focused on those sectors I just mentioned, and we will be releasing that hopefully in the next week or two. Then we've also just finished up a driver safety guide for light commercial and passengers with collaboration with the AA of New Zealand. So please feel free to pop over to our website to grab a copy for yourselves. It's a pretty comprehensive driver guide, so a lot of hard work being put into that one. My colleague is also working on a site markings project, so please watch out for that. That will be coming very soon as well. And then on our website, we've also got a bit around musculoskeletal training, especially for the retail and warehousing sector. And there's other resources also available on our website, especially hierarchies of controls and bow ties. We will be focusing more on hierarchies of controls and bow ties throughout this year. So please feel free to pop over to our website quite frequently and see what are the new resources on our website. Then just before I kick over, we do have couple of another sharing sessions coming up in the next couple of weeks, or let's say 2 months. And I'll be sharing those with you now. We've got Dr. Hilary Bennett towards the end of this month, and she'll be doing a piece around mental well-being by design. Then we've got Jason Johnstone. He's most probably the leading individual currently in New Zealand to talk about harm and arm vibration, also talking from experience, and I'm pretty excited to see that sharing session. Then John Peachy, he's really focused on leadership with the health and safety aspect of it. And he calls himself the chief people mechanic, which is really interesting. He's a really personable guy, and please watch out for that webinar, because that's very exciting and it's going to be very interesting. Some of the key learnings that will pop out of that. And then lastly, we've got Sarah McGuinness that will focus on burnout with a COVID-related theme. Yet again, talking about a lot of her experience there, and she's been doing quite a lot of work with businesses all around New Zealand. So in a nutshell, those are the up and coming events for us. Then guys, just to give you a bit of a fair warning, we've got 4 poll questions if you don't mind to participate. This helps us to get a feeling of where you're at with your journey. And then towards the end of this webinar or sharing session, we have 2 survey questions, and please, we will really appreciate your feedback. So not to you guys any wait further, I'll launch the first poll question. It is a multi-choice question, so all the questions that are related to your business or to you, please select them. And I'm launching the first poll question now. Please feel free to answer honestly, guys. This just helps us and you as well. So first poll question, which of these do you think are loan workers, retail, merchandisers, drivers, which are courier, truck, safety rep, etc., bakers, meter readers, cleaner. We could list quite a number of these, but we just thought that we'll list just a couple of you just to give you the idea. I'll give you guys another couple of seconds to answer. We'll give it another 5 seconds, then we'll move over. And 3, 2, 1, and go. Pretty interesting. Sharing the results quickly. Everybody to see. Petra, I'm not sure if you can see the results.
Yeah, I can.
Brilliant. So 46% has got retail merchandisers as a potential loan worker, drivers 100%, bakers 46%, meter readers 69%, and cleaners 77%. That's pretty good. Appreciate that. I'm just popping over to poll question 2, guys. Launching it now. Have you identified loan or remote working as a critical risk within your business? It's a single answer question, so please select one of the 3 options. Yes being a critical risk, or yes just a general risk, or no, I have not identified this at all. Great. Give you guys another 5 seconds to answer. 5, 3, 2, 1, go. And launching the results. Great, you've got about 23% respondents saying it's a critical risk, 69 saying it's a general risk for them, and 3% saying no, they have not identified it within their business just yet. Okay, 2 more questions, guys. I promise this will go quickly. Sorry guys, sharing the same one, my bad. And launching poll question 3. Yes, again, this is also a multi-choice, so select all that are related to you. Do you currently have a loan worker process and or personal device or app within your business? No, I don't have any of this. Yes, I only use the app, or yes, I just use a device, or yes, I've got an administration control, or yes, I use all of it. Great, I'll give you guys another 10 seconds. Some interesting ones over here. Okay, there you go, and I'm sharing the results. So about 15% is using all of the above. Good 38% is saying they've only got an administration control. 15% say they're using a device, and 8% with an app. I'm assuming that's mobile app, and then 31% is they have no process or device whatsoever. Okay. Then guys, last question. Is it clear what is required for a loan working program? Yes, it's pretty straightforward, or no, I would want some support to understand what that looks like. Okay, I'll give you guys another 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and go. And poll. Pretty good. So 31% say they know exactly what the program should look like. It's pretty straightforward, and a good almost 70% saying they'll need some assistance to understand the complexities when it comes to loan worker. Thank you very much, guys, for participating in that. So without further ado, first of all, I would like to thank Petra again today. She's the founder and CEO of Guardian Angel Safety. Petra has a wealth of experience when it comes to personal safety related tech solutions. She's assisted government departments and SMEs on a variety of networks and a range of risk environments as well. We are very pleased to have all here and taking the time today, as I said, to share their experience in regards to personal safety. So thank you yet again, guys. Make sure if you've got any questions for Petra to use the Q&A function. I'll also monitor the chat. Petra, the floor is yours. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks, Wes. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. It's always a pleasure to share what I'm passionate about, which is obviously using technology to keep people safe. I like this to start our journey together. I think at the time, many of us trying to keep our children alive, and we have oftentimes boys. I know both of my children were risk takers, but my son always felt incredibly dangerous. Always opening child-proof cupboards and gates and getting into pool enclosures and drinking Pamol. And yeah, I often wondered now at 23 how it is that I was able to keep him alive despite his best efforts. But yes, it was success. I kept him alive, but it was a matter of knowing him so well that I was always on the alert. And so looking back, I guess I didn't realize that's where it all started, but it really truly was, because I was constantly having to be a step ahead of him. I think one of the things I also want to acknowledge that these are really weird times. I think these are some of the most difficult times that we've lived through, and certainly we've got thousands of lone workers in the field in Australia and New Zealand, and some of the stories we're hearing are just really horrible. And I think when we're all actually just trying to get by, the last thing that we need is to be exposed to that extent to other people's frustrations and aggression. But that is what many of us are dealing with. And in the retail environment also, you know, when I look at the headlines and the calls that we get from, you know, people are trying to figure out what is a way that they can help protect their staff. A lot of these times we know that they're not necessarily alone. They're around people, but they're away from their colleagues and dealing with the public oftentimes. And unfortunately, the escalation of intimidation and aggression and frustration that we're hearing about out in the field is significant. We look after nearly half of all of councils in New Zealand, so we hear, I guess, mostly from them, but also calls that we get from retail environments and delivery drivers, and not just aggression and problems with people and animals, but things like vehicle incidents outside of cell cover, which also is something that we do a lot of work with, is satellite communications. So I just put these snippets out of the news from the last few months to just acknowledge that it is serious out there, and definitely if there's anything that we can do to help you, there are definitely fast, easy ways to try and ensure that people have another layer of protection while this is going on for everyone out in the field. So I wanted to start with just clarifying what the Health and Safety at Work Act actually says, because it is a little bit ambiguous in part and can certainly be interpreted in multiple ways. So this is taken direct out of the Act, and it's Regulation 21 in relation to remote or isolated work. So the key thing is that you can be remote or isolated because of the location and time or the nature of the work. So you can be isolated without being remote, and being remote without being isolated. So, you know, working alone or separated from colleagues. So whether that's a building site where someone's at the top level and someone else is on the bottom, you're isolated, basically out of line of sight of other people. You know, in a retail environment, in the supermarket, for instance, the person who's out in the car park getting the trolleys back in, he's alone and he's actually quite exposed. We've heard of a few cases where merchandisers are walking to their car to get extra material or even to leave, and are getting, you know, for some reason, someone's taking exception to the brand that they're representing or to the supermarket. So all of these people are exposed in different ways. Obviously, the obvious one is if you're working outside of cell cover, that's pretty black and white, you know, and in particular, if you're some distance away where help might take a while to get to you. There is always greater risk at working outside of normal business hours. You know, we have drivers going into car parks to collect empty bins after hours. We've got bakers who obviously arrive at work at ungodly hours to make us our fresh bread. So oftentimes they're arriving at 3 or 4 in the morning and it's dark. And you know, that time of night, there are all sorts of strange matters after 2 a.m, isn't there, in and around towns, and even more so potentially in remote areas. And obviously communication is a key to not being isolated regardless of where you are. So the examples that are quoted in the guidelines is working late at a building site where everyone else might have left. And we know there was recently in the last year, a young mechanic who was working on a car and after hours, and the hoist that it was on gave way and crushed him. So there's stories like that quite regularly that we hear about and we think, wow, how did that happen? I know that there are people who kind of want to just finish that last bit of work for the day, regardless of where it is that they're working, and sometimes come unstuck doing that. This pretty large office buildings, you know, people who are working late in the office and they're not just being in the building on their own, but actually walking down into a car park on their own or out onto the road to get their car on their own. We see people mowing lawns a lot, and there isn't always someone around. Obviously, forestry is not just hard to get locations, but often out of cell cover as well. Gas stations are quite high risk areas, especially late at night. And one of the key things, which I think this is sort of the crux of what it is that you need to consider. So a PCBU must provide a system of work that includes effective communication with the worker, dependent on the sort of risks that they're facing, and may include a panic system. And a communication system that has gaps in coverage can't be used in an emergency is unlikely to be effective. So I think some of the incidents that we've dealt with, it's definitely obvious that a phone would have been no good. You know, if you are about to be attacked by somebody who you're having an altercation with, we know for a fact that as soon as you pull out a telephone and try and dial emergency services or anybody else, the first thing someone would do who has seriously lost the plot is to grab the phone and smash it. And we have seen that and had that happen, and have people tell us those stories that that's what tends to happen. And if that happens, of course, the phone, that's not only does the GPS potentially not work at all if someone's trying to find you if you've gone missing, but definitely there's no way. And then if you imagine you trying to unlock your phone, dial 111, get hold of an operator and try and explain what it is that's going on and where you are. It's, you know, I talked to someone recently who said, you know, I've been in that situation. And I knew it was better to just run, actually. Like, that phone is a total waste of time if the threat is such that there is no time for you to do any of those things. And I think the other thing is that, you know, if you're in a seriously stressful situation, people will react differently, but also trying to remember where exactly you are, or try and explain to emergency services that you're on the corner of this street and that street outside this shop, when actually what you should be doing is trying to get to safety. So, you know, where a good GPS device will pin your location and will keep tracking if you're running, and that's really important. So one of the things to start off with is that you must obviously complete a risk assessment. And I see from one of the poll questions that 69% of people on this webinar have identified lone and remote working as a general risk, and 23% have identified it as a critical risk, which I think is interesting. So most of the councils we work with have it as a critical risk, but of course it depends on what the environment is. So part of that risk assessment should also be to consider how long the worker will be isolated or alone for in their day or in their week, and what time of day it is, as mentioned before. Where will they be, and will you be able to find them if you're not using a GPS system? What are the risks? So is it animals and people or dangerous terrain? And, you know, we know New Zealand roads are a lot of B-grade roads out there, so driving in New Zealand is a big risk. How far away from emergency services will they be? And what sort of work are they carrying out? You know, are they working with machinery, or are they just driving? Are they working out of cell cover, or are they just driving through patchy cell cover? Will they be loading or offloading on a vehicle? Again, we've seen incidents happen when people are offloading and they're on their own. They might be cleaning up their vehicle at the end of the day in the bay and they're alone. Will they be exposed to aggression, which seems that no matter where you go, unfortunately, in today's world, there's a lot of aggression and frustration. Is fatigue an issue? Lastly, what sort of communication will be available? Do they have radio comms? Do they have a mobile phone? How reliable will the emergency communication be for them if they need it? Do they have the specific skills and training that's required for them to be safe? And in fact, do they even have to do this work alone? Is there a way that they can not have to do this work alone? So, you know, I think there's a lot of things to consider when you're looking at all of the different lone workers. And a lot of people, which I see also on the poll question, don't realize that they have lone workers even. I mean, even McDonald's have lone workers. You know, they're sending people out into the car park with meals. When that person, and often young, inexperienced people, are walking out to the car park to deliver people a meal, and that's sometimes late at night, that person is definitely at risk. So yeah, I think it's interesting, you know, and meter readers are definitely also working on their own in the sense that they can't do a risk assessment of where they are because they are going from home to home doing meter reading, for instance. So they don't know if there's animals or people around or who they're going to encounter. So it's not a fixed site that they can try and gauge what the risk might be on. We had a call from a infrastructure company a few months ago who a cleaner hadn't come home at the end of their shift. The husband actually rang them and said, you know, she hasn't come home. So she was cleaning in an office building and had a medical incident inside that building and didn't come home. So, you know, having the ability to raise an alarm or man down type alarms, impact alarms if someone has a fall if they're alone, is super important, especially if the worker has had medical incidents in the past or is indeed an aging worker, because that's another whole scenario as well, as an aging workforce. So it can be a bit of a minefield out there, I have to say. Many of the people we talk to have been on a bit of a hamster wheel trying to figure it all out. There's about 30 apps minimum, I think, on the market. All do pretty much the same thing. Ultimately, they're being run on your phone. So a lot of how apps will perform is determined by the handset that you're using. The same with, in terms of what sort of cover you're going to have, is largely dependent on the quality of the antenna on your phone. Similarly for GPS chipsets, depends on how good that is in your phone. So it can be a minefield to figure out, is an app enough? And then you look at devices, and there's hundreds of those as well, of lots of varying degrees of quality for sure. And do they have cell cover, and what do you need? So this flowchart is out of our buyer's guide, which I'm happy to share the full guide with you. If you get hold of me, we've got our details at the end of this presentation. So, I mean, the first question is, have you actually identified that you do have staff who are working on their own periods of time? If the answer is no, we've just been through the Health and Safety at Work Act, so you can refer back to that to see if that actually is the case. And if the answer is yes, then the first question is, do they have reliable cell cover? Most people will look at if they're driving through and it's just patchy cover, but they're not actually stopping to work out of cell cover, that's potentially an acceptable risk. So if they are out of cell cover and they're actually working out of cell cover, then the next question is, you know, do they have rugged environments? Because we need to figure out what kind of device it is that you might need. Do they need man down type solutions? Obviously two-way comms is a must, and that should be in any solution that you buy. If you enter buildings, that's a different question again, because GPS can't see through ceilings. And obviously, if you're out of cell cover, then you need an iridium connected device. So this flow chart just sort of does the basic initial, the key things: cell cover, entering buildings. If people are working inside buildings, but it's the same buildings they go to, but they might be multi-story, or it might be up in a roof space, then you can use indoor locating beacons that have RF technology so that you can locate staff once they're inside. If you're in cell cover and you're inside buildings, we have our cell devices tracking every 1 to 3 minutes, so really regular tracking, so that we get a good breadcrumb trail. So if something happens to that person inside the building, we know where they entered that building. And we also oftentimes use their vehicle registration number in our response instructions to pass on to emergency services for faster locating of them. The other thing is that most good cell-based and iridium-based satellite-based devices will speed up the tracking rate when it goes into alarm. It allows the satellites to really lock in a good position, and it continues to track so that if the person's trying to get to safety, the emergency services are still able to find them. So the key thing is, if you have cell cover, but you are going into buildings, then you really need to look at what solution that you are using to make sure that we can still find you if you're in that building. And obviously what that does then is actually affects the battery life. So GPS tracking constantly, and in particular, if you're going into buildings, drains the battery a lot faster. So we look for a minimum of 15 hours on our cell-based devices, and the satellite-based devices, just by their very nature, because people who are going to rugged terrains for a few days on time have sort of between 50 and 300 hours, depending on, and that's on 10-minute tracking, so that we are still getting a good breadcrumb trail. If a device doesn't have functionality like man down and no movement, then the least thing we need is a breadcrumb trail, so that if someone simply doesn't appear at their next appointment or come back at the end of the day, we can log on to a mapping portal and see where they are. So battery life is a thing, battery technology hasn't actually come that far. So a lot of the small devices, the keyring size type ones, they tend to run out of battery very fast. So 5 to 8 hours, they can't constantly track because the battery life can't sustain it. So what they tend to do is only send GPS location when the panic button's pressed. That's fine if you're in view of the sky, but if you are inside a building and you press the panic button, then we won't get a location because the satellites can't get a fix. So a small keyring size device they tend to send a test location depends on the device, but sometimes every 4 or every 12 hours, just to do a test. And then they only send it when it goes into alarm. So if you're going into buildings, that's pointless. And there was a case in Darwin with a council worker that had a few years ago that had a small keyring size device who got it set up on inside a home doing a compliance inspection. And he pressed this panic button, which was, great, because people sometimes forget they even have it if it's not top of mind for them. But of course, the alert was received, but they had no location because he wasn't in view of the satellites. And so they were scrambling around trying to find his calendar to figure out where he was. They couldn't. So literally he had to get himself to safety when he realized no one was coming, but he was quite severely beaten up. And so the risks associated with that are so many, because people, if they have a solution, but then that solution doesn't work, they've got a false sense of security where they think someone's coming and they're not. And what that then means is that they might not help themselves. They might just think someone's coming to get me, and in particular if they're injured. Whereas, so in that case, really, they're better off not having a solution, because then they'll know that that they're on their own and they have to save themselves. So we are really super careful with what we work with, because if you are going to spend the money on something, you want to know that it's actually truly going to work when it's needed. So it needs to have good battery life, because if something happens at the end of the day and that runs out of battery life, that's just not a situation anyone wants to find themselves in. And I guess that's the other thing with apps. We do have apps, and in some instances they're fine, and they're definitely better than nothing. And you can pair them with a Bluetooth button, which makes them a little bit easier to use. But really, the battery life on your phone will drain with GPS tracking, there's no question. So then what happens is people get annoyed with that because their phone runs out halfway through the day, and they turn the app off because they figure out anything that's sitting in the background using tracking does drain. And the other problem is that app developers, the running system, the operating systems, Apple, for instance, a couple of years ago released an update which would auto sleep apps that were running in the background because they're interested in preserving battery life on their phones. And so few of the good developers were able to rewrite the code that the app would wake itself up on regular intervals every couple of minutes to make sure that it wasn't being slept by the running system. So, you know, when there are changes to the operating systems, it can cause havoc with apps. And it's sort of not really something you realize until it's in use, and you might get an opportunity then to do bug fixes, which might be too late if you have an incident in the field in the meantime. The other thing to consider, and I'll go to next slide so that you got something more interesting to look at, is of actual gadgets. So the other thing to consider is if it's safe. So if you're asking people to wear this thing for hours at a time, you want to know that they're still going to be able to have babies in a few years, for instance. So SAR testing, saturation absorbency rating, sorry, I hate acronyms and all sorts of shortened terms because it gets very confusing. Basically, every mobile phone that you can buy in New Zealand has been SAR certified to make sure it's safe for you to sit and talk on. And it's the same with these devices. They're tracking regularly. The cell-based ones have two-way voice, so they have a network signal. And so you want to know that it can be worn on the person for hours at a time without causing them any harm. So a SAR certification that's from a authorized laboratory is really important. And there are lots of junky little gadgets on the market that don't have them. So if you are looking for a solution, that is definitely one to check for, is to ask if it's SAR certified. And look, we have a lot of the projects we've rolled out, we've had staff, oftentimes it's not the main driver of why they ask. They usually have a cynical attitude to having a GPS device, but one of the things that they might try and do is say it's not safe for me to wear it. So actually knowing that you can then produce a SAR certificate to show them that it is in fact safe is a good tool to have in your tool belt just in case. The other thing I think to consider, so, you know, the starting point really for lone worker stuff is an app. And then you can pair the app with a button and that makes it a little bit safer. And then you go to a device. So the small devices, like I say, often have problems with battery life. In terms of automatic features like impact and no movement alerts, they're a real pain with wearables like watches and pendants and tags that hang off you. Just by the very nature of how people behave, you know, when we talk, you wave your arms around. I know I'm the best at knocking over glasses, always the nicest wine at the time, of course. But, you know, so man down alarms are constantly sent from wearables because they can be hard to configure to the degree where they are going to actually work with any real purpose if you make them too unsensitive, desensitized. So the next step up from the smaller devices is the cell-based tracking pendants. And again, the other thing with the small devices is the constant tracking isn't usually available because of the size of them. The battery can't sustain it, which means that they might be SAR certified, but not for 1 to 3 minute tracking rates, only for 1 or 2 location updates a day, for instance. The cell-based tracking pendants will have two-way voice. So it will automatically dial and operate. Well, for us, when we're monitoring solutions, we have an auto dial. It goes direct to an emergency line, so the operator can hear what's happening, which is really valuable. Our second operator will get on the line to police to give situational awareness, because we can hear what's going on. When we train users in the use of these solutions, we tend to make sure that they're aware that if they're in an incident, to try and, obviously, oftentimes, usually they would have had de-escalation training as well, so they know how to try and talk to an aggressor in terms of trying to calm the situation down. We also encourage them to press the button if you start to feel it get hairy, so that you have an operator listening to what's happening. You can always stand them down. It's better to have someone there with you if it's starting to get, a bit aggressive. So two-way voice is a really important feature of a cell-based pendant. The constant tracking, once it's an alarm, it updates to every few seconds. We did have an animal control officer. We've actually got one who's had a few incidents. His latest incident, he was threatened with a knife, and he tried to de-escalate. It wasn't working. Our operator could hear him say, "Please put the knife down." So we had police on the way straight away. John knew the operator was listening to what was happening. He decided to try and get himself to safety. So he jumped over some fences and went into the back gardens and around the neighborhood to try and hide and keep himself safe. The police were aware that that's what was happening. He also was telling the operator the descriptions of the perpetrator and the dog that he was trying to uplift. So what that meant was that when the police were making their way to the location, they had a description of the perpetrators and the dog, so that they could look out for them while they were driving towards John. And so that was really useful, and that was because we had 2 operators on the call. John knew that the device is tracking him, so he knew he didn't have to worry about letting them know where he was, which is really valuable. And the other thing that comes into that is the hands-free component. Knowing that you've got an operator there listening, you can talk to them without having to press anything or hold anything, also becomes incredibly valuable in these situations. So in this instance, the police, when they arrived, knew sort of round about what number of the street he was at the back of, so they were able to call out to him to let him know that it was safe to come out. So, actually that same animal control officer is also a paramedic, and used his device when he was in the bank because someone had a heart attack, and he was administering CPR and first aid, and was able to talk to the operator hands-free while he was doing that to give instructions to the ambulance crew for when they arrived or what he was dealing with. So again, those things aren't possible to do if you're trying to talk on a phone. I think the other thing actually with a good device is the mapping portal that it sits on, where you have total visibility of hours of use per device, so you know your investment is actually being used, and compliance, you know that people are using it and they're being safe. And the other thing it will often have is mass messaging. It's the same with the satellite products. I'll talk about the satellite products as well in a minute. Sorry, I'm skipping around. I have a tendency to get myself off track. That's that for cell-based tracking pendants. The satellite-based pendants, the key thing with satellite comms, if you're out of cell cover, is to make sure it's on the iridium network. PLBs and spot devices and EPIRBs are not using the iridium satellite network. The iridium network has twice the number of satellites, and it has forwarding technology. Basically, it's the only network that can, with 100% confidence, state there is no black spots, which there isn't. But again, it's relying on satellites for communication as well as locating, so it needs to be in view of the sky. So if you have people who are going into buildings out of cell cover, there is only one solution that I have found, and please, if you come across any others, do let me know. I do travel to the Lone Worker Conference in the UK every couple of years, and I'm always on Geek magazines and talking to providers overseas. The only solution we have so far found has been the pendant and bridge solution, which is that sort of white box that you see in the middle down the bottom there, that bridge stays in view of the sky and the pendant is on the person. So they have a really, a commercial grade, like a 2K link between the bridge and pendant, which means that it will work from inside a building. So there is a solution to mitigate every risk, literally. All of the good solutions have automated welfare checks on satellite and cell cover. So if there's someone who's a higher risk or working late at night or has recently had a medical diagnosis, you might want to put some extra layers of safety around them. The other thing with the satellite solutions, they obviously don't have two-way voice, but they do have two-way text messaging. So you still have effective communication. And that's really important, because if you're, for instance, relying on a vehicle solution that has impact and rollover alerts, or in fact a panic button, if you have no way to communicate with that staff member, it's pretty tricky to try and get emergency services to go to something that you can't verify and you have no comms. And so it becomes challenging when you're talking about an actual response to a solution if there is no two-way communication. So being able to report, so all of the good solutions have should have a great mapping portal where you can log on and have visibility of all your staff. Mass messaging is something that's become a bit of a hot topic the last couple of years, in terms of having visibility of where everyone is, regardless if they're on an app or a cell pendant or a satellite solution, is being able to know if something's happening, if there's a civil defense emergency or there's a lockdown in your building, you need to be able to send a message to your staff to let them know to not come to a particular part of town, or indeed any part of town where you've been advised there's something happening. You don't. During the mosque shootings, there were a lot of companies that had staff in that area, in that vicinity, and they didn't know exactly where they were. And they're desperately trying to get hold of their people to check that they weren't in that vicinity. So it really highlighted the importance of having visibility of where your people are, so that you can A, know they're safe, but also B, let them know if they need to be out of somewhere. And so all of these good solutions will have the ability for you to select via a geofence the people who are in a particular area, or via Teams to send a mass message to them to let them know that they need to evacuate an area or stay away from an area. And that's a super powerful tool as well. So the other thing that we'd like to do as well is we test everything every month to make sure that the users haven't got complacent, because we know it always creeps in with safety, because nothing's going to happen to me. So we get them to test their panic every month, so that we know they're confident using it. They get to talk to the operator. Really good practice for our operators as well. And it just keeps it on top of mind, so that 1% of the time when things do line up to go terribly wrong, we know that the solution you've got in place is 100% going to work. There just can't be any compromises. If you're going to have a solution in place, make sure your staff are confident of how it works, and they trust it, that it's going to keep them safe. So most companies we talk to have naysayers or cynics when it comes to GPS. So socializing the idea of introducing a GPS connected device is super important. And I think, communicating, and this is a bit of a facetious slide, but I think sometimes I'm guilty of it too. I go on my journey and it all making sense to me. And then by the time I'm introducing it to my team, I've kind of forgotten to take them on the journey with me. So super important to start communicating that, hey, we're looking at this, and to really don't use the word tracking ever, because that really conjures up Big Brother stuff. So, I think just communicating that, hey, actually, compliance-wise, it's something we have to do. We've identified it as a risk, and so we need to mitigate it. Here are some of the things that we're looking at. How do you feel about that? And having a GPS policy, if you've got a vehicle GPS solution, you might already have a GPS policy. If you don't, I really suggest you have one. And in particular, when it comes to something that's worn by your people, is to restrict the access to who has access to the portal. Sometimes we don't know if we've got little sort of pocket Hitlers in our midst that like to micromanage everyone, and it does rear its ugly head on relatively regular occasions. that someone's using the solution to actually see what time someone turned up for work or what time they left for the day, those kind of things. It really shouldn't be used for that. That really is terrible for culture, and a really good way to ensure your staff turn their devices off and put foil over the antennas. So, you know, make sure that the people who have access to the portal need access, and that you have a lone worker policy. You share with staff who it is that has access to it. Suncorp Group in Australia, when they implemented their solution, which is years ago now, they had a GPS policy which stipulated that staff have to instigate communication unless there is justifiable concern for their whereabouts, in terms of they didn't show up somewhere. If that is the case, and we do use the solution to try and call into the device to see if they are there and if they're okay, and to look on the map to see if they're moving, the only people that could do that at Suncorp was the security team, which is 6 people that manage all 12,000 staff. So that was it. And police, if we decided we needed to get police to patch in, then we would give them access to it as well. And that was the only way. So team leaders and managers could contact the security team to find out, to get them to check on the portal to make sure their person was moving, and to try and call into the device to get a two-way comms, because maybe the person wasn't answering their phone. We also actually had a bushfire over there where the person's phone had gone flat, and they called the device because the wind had shifted. So there's all sorts of actually instances. And also actually John, who we've had all of our incidents with, not all of them, but he's had quite a few for one person. He also rang our monitoring centre to call his colleague who was in an area where there was an incident happening, and John knew that his colleague was a lot closer than he was, but he wasn't answering his phone. So our operators called into the colleague's device to tell him that there was an incident happening and where it was, to get him there faster. So, you know, there's all sorts of unusual ways sometimes that the solutions are used. The monthly, you know, testing and the refresher training and the training of end users in the solution is also really important. You can't just choose a solution, chuck it out there and say, here, use this. You know, people have to be trained in it. You have to be able to show. If you're audited, and I know this because we hear this from our clients, if WorkSafe audit you, they're going to ask you, A, do you have something? B, do your staff know how it works? So you need to be able to show user manuals and training. And we always get staff to sign into the training sessions so that we've got a record that they've been there. The monthly testing shows that you know the technology is working, you know that people know how it works. So that's also, you get a monthly test report. So, you know, that's a really useful thing as well. It's no good having something you're paying for every month and then it's not getting used. So we know that there's a health provider in New Zealand that have, not with us, but they have over 1,000 licenses. And when they've reviewed it, it's for apps, sorry, I should have clarified, for lone worker apps. They've got 1,000 of them. And of course, apps can't be shared because they have to live on the phone. So whereas devices, we can share them around Teams, with an app, they have to have their own. So they were paying for over 1,000 licenses, and on any given day, only 40 people were logging on. So, you know, false economies and really not great safety. So you want to know it's getting used. And communication, we have some comms kind of ideas if you need help with that at any point. I think one of the things, so Hawke's Bay are happy for me to share the story, but they had a staff member who didn't come home at the end of the day, and he had done his end of day administrative sort of risk mitigation call. It was a Friday afternoon, and he had called in to say he was finishing up and he was safe. That call he made when he was still in cell cover, because he knew he was going to leave cell cover after he left site at about 5 o'clock. So at around 8 o'clock that night, his wife is wondering why he hasn't come home and is ringing colleagues that she has numbers to, and the search began for where he was. He had a vehicle solution, but most vehicle solutions are only cell-based, so they rely on the vehicle being in cell cover to send the information of location. So when they looked at that, it only had the last known location. A lot of vehicle solutions are not live. Yes, they're GPS, but they're not live tracking. So he was out of cell cover. He did have an old satellite device in his car, which they were able to log on to the mapping portal, and that's how they found him. So he had unfortunately left the road, and there wasn't any saving him, which is a really tragic story. And doing a review for them on their solutions that they had in place was, I found, really heartbreaking and intimidating, because there is just a palpable empty seat at the table in that team. And I don't think it ever quite repairs itself, and it's just a shame that oftentimes it takes that for us to realize that actually there are lots of different layers that we can put in place to keep people safe. And again, it's about having not just the alert being sent through, but having someone do something about it quickly. And this is sort of the next step in the success criteria, is a reliable, fast way to get the alerts with someone ready to respond to send help. So we have API integrations with all of our solutions. And so what that means is that our operators, as soon as that alert is triggered on the device, it hits our response software at the same time. We have a direct dial line to emergency services, so we're not dialing 111. And it's getting help in that golden hour. So most injuries that happen in New Zealand are survivable, 80% of them. But the key is getting help fast. So again, it's kind of not just having a gadget, but having a good, suitable solution. Staff know how to use it. The receiving of the alert is safe and fast and reliable. And the response coordinations happen fast and reliably. So when servers, if it's an overseas-based solution and the messaging is generated from an overseas server, there are, as you can see on this chart, spam filters in place, which the Electronic Messaging Act that was passed and really started getting acted on 2 years ago in New Zealand has caused a lot of messages to get caught up in spam filters. So relying on an email or an SMS to alert, to respond to critical alert is really not a particularly safe way of doing things. There are lots of different methods of doing this, and we know that there are lots of companies doing it different ways. And so again, we're always happy to help with guidance and advice on what is the actual safest way to do this, because what's the point of doing it if it's not going to be 100%? So really the key is having the best fit for purpose, suitable technology, which can be a little bit hard to cut through the white noise. Fit for role processes. If people are sharing devices, if they're not going into the office before they go out, how do you manage that? We've got companies who have satellite communicators in every vehicle because the staff are taking company vehicles, and that way they know that no matter where they go, they've got communication. And having your people on board. Without all of those three key things, it's not going to all come together. The customer in the middle of this is your people. And I think one of the really rewarding things for us is knowing that actually it improves staff culture. If people feel safe, not only do they feel that you show that you care about their safety, so they're loyal. And actually it's also proven that they work better when they feel safe, because they're not worrying all the time about being safe, and they know that their employer cares for them. So, they're more productive and they don't have to worry about their safety as much, whether that's conscious or subconscious, but it's super powerful. And sorry, I know I've drowned you with lots of information. It's nearly been an hour, and I'm always shocked at how long I can talk about this stuff. But please, if you have questions, I would love to answer them.
Thank you, Petra. That was some really interesting stuff. And I can see the passion that you talk with on this topic. So good on you for this. I do have a couple of questions so far, guys. So if you want to ask a question, please pop in the Q&A function, or even in the chat. I'll quickly have a look at it if we've got time, but I'll shoot some of the questions I've got thus far. So one of the questions, Petra, is, are any of your devices within your organization Wi-Fi capable to enable locations within buildings using maps to be found using Wi-Fi access points?
That's a good question. We don't have Wi-Fi in the devices yet, because it tends to be a little bit unreliable in terms of having access to the local Wi-Fi. We do use indoor locating beacons, which are not hardwired. They're on a 5-year-long battery life, and they use a really sturdy radio frequency to communicate with the pendants. So when someone walks past, it will identify who it was that walked past and the nearest beacon, which means if someone walks past that beacon, if we get an alarm in a particular area of the building, we'll get the person's device ID and name as well as the nearest locating beacon. So that's what we tend to use at the moment. And that's actually really important for multi-level buildings that are high risk, or big roof spaces like the airport, kind of, you know, where you might have electricians or staff working in those areas and you need to locate them quickly. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Another question here is, what is the biggest challenge you have encountered from a company or staff member who does not want to be tracked, and how has this been handled, if any different to what you have all noted already?
Yeah, it's a good question, because actually most, and unfortunately I had someone actually pull their pants down to show me their hip, that they had a red mark where the device was sitting on their pocket. That was unpleasant. You know, I think so. We had one company who had a group of people, about 60 people, who had worked so autonomously for so long, they were really resistant wearing these devices. And what became quite obvious, and always usually does, is the people who are the most resistant are basically doing things they shouldn't be doing during the day. So we did, the manager in the end, it actually prompted him. The person was basically trying to discredit the solution by saying that the location was always wrong when he tested. So we were constantly having to go onto the portal and run reports to prove that it was correct. And then he was saying that the device was running at a battery life. And so what we were able to run reports on off the firmware was when the device had been pushed, that what the battery life was when he was turning it off. So it taught us a lot, because we had to dig into the firmware of the technology to get all the button presses he had done. To, you know, people try and destroy their devices sometimes and say that the device is just not working. So this particular person, it was only 1 out of the 50, but he went to extreme lengths to discredit the solution, including, you know, we had to show him the SARS certification. We had to give him reports constantly about how actually it was working. In the end, because we were looking on the portal so long and so often, and so was the health and safety manager, what happened was that we noticed that he was outside the ice rink for hours, a couple of days a week during the day when he was meant to be working. So it kind of became an HR issue. And they didn't sort of really even narrow it down at that point to trying to, you know, because they didn't want to ruin their culture, right? So what they basically ended up doing was performance managing him and advising him that our lone worker policy has been updated to include the use of these solutions to keep you safe. And so if you want to work with us, you have to wear it. End of story, basically. So I think having an updated lone worker policy becomes really important in those instances, so that you can share that at the time of training and at the time of implementation. So it's really clear to people that this is a safety solution and it is now part of our policies. And if you want to work here, you have to use it. That company, if you know, as staff turnover happened, new staff were really excited that the company took safety so seriously and really loved it. So they slowly but surely had a culture change happen. And again, if you need help with lone worker policies, I have a number of samples I'm happy to share if you want to email me. We have a bias guide and we have a data gathering template to help figure out who, what, where, and also lone worker policies that we are happy to send you if you would like them.
Excellent. Guys, I know we're basically just at our 12 o'clock now. If you would like to stay on for the last 2 questions, please feel free. So Petra, I've got 2 more questions here. What do you recommend if finance is a big hurdle for a small business?
Yeah. Yep. I think an app with a Bluetooth button is definitely better than not having anything. So that is a starting point. We also have a little thing called a duo that has man down as well as the pull tab for alarm that pairs with your phone. It's definitely better than nothing. The next step up then is to start with a couple of pendants or a pendant so that you can share them among staff, and maybe even we have companies who face their implementations. So they identify the highest risk people first. And they start with them getting 1 or 2 devices for them for particular jobs or trips that are deemed to be high risk. And then slowly they add more devices over time. And you know, so there are lots of different ways that you can do that, and you can definitely share devices. What we hear from lawyers case study wise is that the practicable term does apply, but it's a pretty hard one to use unless you are really running thin as a business in terms of spending $600 odd on a device. And definitely an app is obviously really reasonable in terms of you don't really have any outlay costs initially, but you have a monthly fee. So I think there is a starting point, and an app, you know, if app is a good starting point for socializing as well, although a lot of people don't like having to have it on their phones, you know. So definitely always happy. And if it's a non-for-profit, you know, we always try and work to make sure that we can give them the best solution to keep people safe.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And then the last question is pretty long one. Do you what do you think where we're at when it comes to New Zealand on lone workers? Is it a risk that is still under the radar for most businesses? If so, why do you think that?
Yeah, you know, it's really interesting. We've got a few clients in Australia, and we've only just sort of started promoting ourselves a bit more over there. And the conversations are different for sure. You know, I think the Health and Safety Act is more mature in Australia, and I think they have also got a more they are way more aware of risk. I think it's because there's so many things trying to bloody kill you in Australia, with spiders and snakes and sharks and things. So they definitely have a different attitude to it. I do think that a lot of companies just don't see it as a critical risk or have even identified it as a risk. I think it's partly an education thing, and you know, WorkSafe have been our client for 7 years, and they themselves have, you know, with the 250 inspectors, they all have slightly different kind of ways to interpret the act themselves. So I think it can be super confusing for people to figure out whether they should have it as a critical risk or a general risk. And it's, yeah, I think it's education. And I think that I know now that WorkSafe, it is one of the areas that they are going to be focusing on, partly due to what they themselves are seeing as an organization with their lone and remote workers in terms of escalation of aggression and frustration in the communities. And so they are focusing on it. And I know the customers that I've spoke to who've been audited, that has been a question, you know, is it an identified risk, and what are you doing to mitigate it? And show us what you're doing, and show us that it works, and show us that your people are engaging. Because again, just saying that, oh yeah, they've got an app, but not being able to show that people are actually using it, is not going to fly. And I think that will become more and more of a focus over the next year or so, as people start to go back out into the, you know, out into the workplaces, and more. At the moment, it feels like we're in a stealth lockdown mode. But I think that it's, yeah, definitely more of a focus. And like I say, in Australia, it's definitely probably a good 2 or 3 years ahead of where we are in terms of identifying it and solving it.
Okay, interesting. Guys, so this is basically the end. If you've got any further questions for Petra or myself, please drop us an email or give us a tinkle. Before I say goodbye, guys, just remember there will be a survey. It's only 2 questions. Feel free, please, to answer those questions. Really much appreciate the feedback. This will just help us with the content that we can provide you in the future. In saying that, guys, thank you very much for coming along today and participating in today's webinar of Lone Worker. And yet again, just another thank you to Petra for taking the time and sharing her experience and potential solutions for your business. I hope you all stay safe and take care. Thank you very much, everybody. Yeah.
Thanks for coming along.